Guenther Dobrauz is a partner and leader of PwC Legal. How is it possible to love a lawyer so much? It is. It really is. Because in addition to the work that he does at PwC Legal, he and his team have advised some of the most important companies working in the space. He is literally building the law firm of the future. And his team will also help you stay out of prison. He's also one of the coolest lawyers I've ever met, Guenther Dobrauz.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Eric. Almost no pressure here, cannot feel it. Thank you so much for having me, and a good morning to you. I've been asked coming in if I will do my disruption dance kind of spiel today, and I said no, today I'm only talking regulation, and the reason is after my little introduction speech here we will have one of the most amazing panels ever. If you're considering the future of anything really in cryptocurrencies and blockchain, regulation, as we've just heard, is key. And so you need to anticipate where this is going. And we will have some of the key movers and shakers and thought leaders in the space coming up here. Now, to make the most out of their presence is we really want them to dig deep on the panel. So the idea is that I quickly give you the status quo of where we're at right now globally on regulation. And why this is important is because I firmly believe that regulation has become a strategic dimension. When I started in this game as a lawyer 20-some years ago, I was focusing on regulation and compliance, and that was basically a back office affair. So I was usually talking to sort of underlings in the organization, trying to get some money to fix something so the organization doesn't have to pay a fine somewhere. Whereas after the financial crisis, when this entire regulatory tsunami was unleashed upon the financial services industry, regulation has become a key dimension, because it today, if you are in the financial services space, determines your business, the way you have to structure it and the way you have to run it. Today, in this interconnected world where increasing transparency happens as a result of the regulation, non-compliance is not an option. So you gotta get it right. And yesterday it was said that people are trying to find locations, and it's not about regulatory arbitrage downwards, at least not for the ones that are in it for the long run. They want certainty, they want predictability. That's why they're trying to find locations that give them guidance that will allow them to build something. Now that sounds really good, especially if you say it real fast, because as just came out of the discussion we've heard, it's not that easy, because there is not one single rule book out there, and it's not even on the horizon. By the way, we've never had that. If you look at established financial services space, you basically have kind of 3 blocks out there. You have the European block with some islands like Switzerland in between. You have the US, and then you have Asia, and then you have sort of Middle East and LATAM, which are sort of combinations of the various systems. Now today, you can have 17 licenses in Europe, from the BaFin in Germany, from the FNA in Austria, from FINMA in Switzerland. If you want to play in the US, you have to see the SEC about it, right? There is no way you can passport that in, like in Europe. So again, you have to build a parallel structure. And the same is true if you're going to other markets. So I believe that the hope that we will ever have one solution that allows us to cater to the entire world, that will never happen, right? The US will not partake, in my humble view, because here it's my way or the highway, right? And they will define their rules, and rightly so. It's their country, right? So the question is, how do you do that? How do you get it right, and what's the mixture of it all? Now, I started in the fund space, and my sort of main driver was always to find the best solution possible for everybody, how you could cater to your economy. Because the worst thing that can happen, and I've seen it time and time again, is a great product, a great idea wrapped up in the wrong way. I've seen so many investors talk to opportunities and they say, we love it, but we can't get into it, right? It doesn't check the box. We can't do it for tax reasons, for legal reasons, for compliance reasons. So you gotta think about it. And I'm afraid I will not be able to offer you the one solution, but I'm just trying to map sort of the key elements which you need to consider depending on where you're at. When we talk regulation of the crypto space and the blockchain space, there's really 2 levels. The one is of the institutions providing services and products. That is sort of framed by the established framework, for better or worse, usually for worse, because we have new opportunities that are up against a regulatory reality of the past. We're trying to squeeze something new into the context of that old, which doesn't really do it justice, and that is what's triggering all the questions around it. And we're talking mostly ICOs, right? That's the big thing, at least of the past 24 months or so, which is like, what is the regulation out there? Now, one sentence I always have to stick in when it comes to ICOs is ICO is just another funding mechanism for early stage ventures. That's what it is, right? So that's the risk profile you have, and that's what it's about. But you're changing the investor profile. Whereas venture capital was largely an institutional man's game and women's game increasingly, right? Because it was mainly funds and institutional qualified investors getting into it. ICOs are going after the retail market by and large. So obviously, we also heard yesterday the bubble. Yes, it's there, it's building up, it's probably already built up, and it will burst, and there will be blood on the street, and the people whose blood will be running are retail investors. So it's a different story whether you're a venture fund or a hedge fund in the worst case, which nobody likes anyway out on the street, right? Or if you are basically spilling the blood of retail investors. This will trigger the regulatory reaction. So this is where most of the things have been. And at PwC Legal, we've tried to map what's going on. That is sort of, we put up this global regulatory compass, which sort of shows you the state of regulation in those countries. And we never even got to print it because it's moving so fast and it's changing so fast, so it's only available online. And interestingly, what you see is, by and large, most of the countries that have kind of relevance in this space have issued their warnings, and they're sort of wary and have emerging regulations. There's very few who are actually opposed to it. They're the ones in red, and obviously there's a reason for that, and that's why they are painted in red, and it's usually with some kind of political connection. They want to control the monetary inflows and outflows, and the things you can't see are the open ones, right? Those welcoming, they're the yellow ones, and as was discussed yesterday, it's small places, it's agile places. And you know, why is Switzerland big in this, and why is the US considered to be a bit restrictive? I believe it's in the DNA. Switzerland is decentralized by definition, right? So we have a consensus mechanism, so it sort of resonates with Switzerland. The United States, yes, on the federal, on the state level, you know, we have that, but otherwise it's a strong federal system. And yes, all those tools of personal liberation, from LSD to surfing to mobile phones, they come from here around, and that's all good and fine. But once it gets to the collective level, that's a federal one, a concentrated one. So it's centralization and not decentralization. And this is why I believe personally it's so difficult to get this lined up. So this is sort of where we're at globally right now. If you take a look at the US, it looks something like this. And I know, thinking about it, putting Texas and California into the same color is a difficult one. It's not saying it's the same kind of regulation. It's just saying there is a regulation, and then in other places there's emerging regulations, and in some there's none. So again, it's developing vastly, and as has been said, you need to think about it, whatever you want to do. Now, looking at the big blocks out there, Europe, I'm proud to say, has become one of the thought leaders and one of the pacemakers in this industry. When we say Europe, that's largely places like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Malta, and so forth, and the EU. And when we say the EU, really there's a name to that, and we will have her on the stage later on. And then, you know, there's great things taking shape. I think the first sort of major piece of thought leadership was the EU FinTech action plan and the policy. And I'm not going through that. You can get the slides afterwards, but just show you the thinking. So essentially, they want to make it easier for everybody to access the harmonized market, because one of the huge disadvantages of Europe versus the US in particular is that it's made up of a number of countries, and they all have different systems, but they invented this idea of the passporting, and they want to bring it to the fintech space. And most importantly, and for the purposes of this conference, is obviously the initiative to promote blockchain. So blockchain has been recognized as an important transformative technology of the future, and the EU has decided that they want to be a powerhouse in this game. Right? I mean, everybody is seeing that basically the global game is on between the US and China largely, and Asia, and Europe is sort of at risk to become a museum for chocolate and watches in between. And this is not where we want to be, right? We got intellectual capital, and this is what's got to be leveraged, and this is what the EU is doing. And Switzerland, obviously, which wants to add crypto and blockchain to the watches and the chocolates. Crowdfunding regulation. Still in the making and hot off the press. I think it was 2 days ago, if I get it right, that the big discussion happened. And why I'm bringing it up here, again, it's the same kind of dynamic. They want to open it up to the market. They want to unleash the potential of the money that is not available for funding. We have the value of death when it comes to venture capital funding in Europe, but it now also does include language about ICOs. And we will discuss this later on the panel. So this is important. This will shape the future of crypto and ICO and blockchain in the EU, and it's all well underway. So I believe in the next 24 months, we will see even more precise and tangible regulation being rolled out across Europe. Now we got Eva here joining us later. She is the brain behind and the champion of the EU blockchain resolution, which was adopted, I'm proud to say, in May, which I believe only one or two naysayers. No, I think it was only one, yes. So I was really proud of this one. And again, not going into the details, we can do this when we go into this panel. The important thing is here that basically it is a commitment to support that space, to build up observatories, to build up dedicated sandboxes and laboratories, and to really get A, the head around, and B, the money and the power behind that. So yes, there is this commitment, and we've seen it in the US. You know, things can be quickly derailed. All it takes is one wrong administration. That was not, as my personal opinion, obviously, not a firm opinion. And, you know, everything can come to a grinding halt. And, you know, we've heard from Brian, you know, where things are moving. But, you know, right now it doesn't look like that. Yes, we got Brexit lurking in the EU, but it doesn't look like it's going to be derailed. So I'm quite convinced that this will go forward. Now, the US, I don't think I have to preach to the choir too much. You know what it's all about. But one thing I always like to highlight, it's not just the SEC. We get other players, standard setters, regulators at the table as well. CFTC, everybody has been looking at the launch of futures in that space. Obviously, FinCEN, AML, KYC, still the dominant theme everybody is thinking about. And the IRS, right? Most of regulation at the end of the day is about taxation, right? So we should not forget about that. Very important to get it right. And when you think about structuring, you obviously need to, in particular, think about the tax dimension. Quite so often we see European, Asian, Middle East investors who want to get into a venture, backing it by venture funding or ICO in the US. Well, when they think about the tax consequences and the prospect of potentially being eligible for filing tax returns in the US, this is sort of when the opportunity becomes less attractive. So if you're going after the market, you need to structure it well to avoid that pitfall. On the other hand, if you're based in Europe or anywhere else, you need to be able to include, if you so want, US investors in a compliant way. You have to make sure that you see the SEC about it, and you have to make sure that you do it in a way so you do not cross-contaminate from a tax perspective, which is not easy. So do pay attention to this. Here's a little bit of our view of what should be thought about when creating the future of regulation in the US, and what you should be thinking about when you're developing your product or your institute around that. More or less the things that we're seeing as being sort of the guiding principles of the emerging European regulation, and is what's being discussed. The one thing I always point to is number 3. Everybody is not thinking enough, in my point, about cyber. Right? When there is a hack on, everybody's thinking about it, but you have to think all the way through, like law firms. I mean, what about the cybersecurity of a law firm, right, in that equation? I mean, let me not go there, right? So all of those things will be important, and it will be important when you're educating your regulators that you have that in mind, because their job is to build the trust in society and to build the trust in the technology and the system. Howey test yesterday over dinner, somebody was sitting next to me. He said, if I hear another presentation about the Howey test, I will shoot myself and the person on the stage. So I'm not sure if she's here. But so I'll skip it. You know it. But the reason I actually like the Howey test is because it's giving you a framework that allows you to think about it, to guide it, to build it in a way that is sustainable. SAFT project, it's not a regulation in that sense. It's basically a self-regulatory reaction of the market. I always say it's basically banking on the insurance of your law firm. And you know, it's sort of hoping that you will fit in there. But again, it's a framework. It's in process. There will be updates to it. There's further development underway, but it is very important. Again, not going into the details because you've probably heard it a million times anyway, and this is how you do it. There's a lot of discussion right now about security tokens, utility tokens, and so forth. And again, you see here a coming together of the two worlds. Also the Swiss regulator, which obviously is closest to my heart, and practice very clearly said, and it's important for all those coming to Switzerland trying to do their utility token there, and I've seen very few that actually fly, that you need to be aware, if you have a utility token, you need to be able to provide the utility. Now this is covering the phase leading up to the availability of the utility, whereas in Switzerland, if you do not have it up and running within reasonable time, and we're talking months, not years, the qualification will go away. And then by default, you fall into the other class, potentially security token, whatever, and then you have a problem because then you didn't potentially check the boxes.
Even though you are my favorite lawyer, you get the music as well.
Totally.
I'm so sorry. I know we want to see the rest of it, but we really do not.
It's fine. It's only one more sentence, and that is that the American philosophers, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, said the sun may rise in the east, but it settles in the final location, i.e. in the west. I'm not sure if this is referring to the east and the west coast kind of spiel going on, but if they meant it on a macro level, I think they got it wrong, because everybody misses what's going on in Asia, sort of coming from Europe and the US. I think Asia is where it's at. You know, if you look at the mining, if you look at the trading and so forth, and the things going on there are amazing as well. It comes down to Singapore and Hong Kong as the dominant sort of hubs, but you know, one change in China will change the world forever. So Asia is the other element we need to look at, and I'm really happy that we have representation on the panel around that. I promised if you want the slides with all the details, you can get them from me. And essentially, here you have my contact details back there with all the channels from Telegram, and it's actually my private Telegram, and WhatsApp and email and telephone. So please do feel free to hit me up on this one, and I'll get it through to you.